Okay, let's see. Elaine, have you nailed the lights for me, Emily? Thank you. That way we can see what we're looking at. Okay, so we left off talking about the various offshoots of Cubism in the 1910s, how important the movement was, and how other artists picked up on some of the things they were doing, but began to sort of branch off in directions that were not exactly similar to what Picasso and Braque were doing, although had some overlaps. And so one of the things we saw as we looked at this group from the suburbs of Paris, from the Puteaux suburb of Paris, the group that was called the Orphists, right? We saw them interested in movement, but instead of the viewer moving and seeing some solitary still object from multiple points of view, instead we have a moving object depicted on the canvas. The other thing we saw with the Orphists was an interest in depicting things that were not tangible, solid, visible, right? Paintings depict the visible, but many of our Orphists are trying to depict the invisible. And we see again and again an interest in sound, which is something you cannot see. So Delaunay, who we left off with last week, is using color as an analogy for the blast of a gun in an image that he derived from the cover of a magazine, which we talked about on Friday. Others use color as an analogy for sound, composition as an analogy for sound. He's picking up on things that Cubists have done. It's partly collage. You can tell quite easily that both of the human figures are collage. But the point of eruption, where the blast of the gun starts, that crosshair in the middle, is also a collage. And for Delaunay, color is power. Color has strength. He talked about the fact that light can obliterate things, right? And this idea that there are these powerful forces that you can't see is a really strong theme in the early 20th century with the advent of radio, with the advent of X-rays, right? All of this led to the idea that there are things in this world that are very palpable, right? Very real, but at the same time kind of supernatural. You can't see them, right? They're not visible. And Delaunay is one of many artists who are focusing on this idea of the painting the unseen. Their works become more than Picasso and Braque. Picasso and Braque's always about the stuff you can see. Always, right? If they want to talk about sound and want to evoke sound, they're going to show you a guitar, right? They're not going to show you sound waves. So they're much more tangible than that. And you're always looking at one solid object from multiple sides. And yeah, they dematerialize it, but there's still that idea of the tangible object, right? It still lies a guitar, a naked woman, a guy's face, right? Always the same. And here we get these themes that allow the artist to explore quasi-spiritual ideas, right? They're not spiritual in the classic sense of being religious in any particular way, but they're spiritual in a broader, more humanist sense of the fact that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding, and there are things in this world that art should take us to, places where it should transport us to. We use that term for art, right? Transports us. Well, where does it transport us to? Well, away from here, right? Away from this ugly-ass building that we study in, you know. Sorry, that's recorded. I got tenure. I don't care. Let him fire me. I'm tired of being sheriff. Let somebody else take that job. Right? Anyway, supposed to transport us away from, you know, the humdrum. Isn't day-to-day life pretty humdrum, right? You know, you get up, you make your cereal, you come to school, they tell you stuff to do, you got to sit in rooms and listen to boring people, and you go home and you start the same thing again the next day. You know, there's something about it that can become really, the older you get, really depressing. And art should take us somewhere better, right? to transport us. And these artists are very much interested in doing exactly that. And they're part of a group, a larger group, that, the Orphists is just one part of it, that are really interested in this. And they've noticed the date. They're getting interested in this idea of transporting away from mundane reality at a time when war is breaking out. And that has to be a huge influence on this. Because once you realize that the way we treat each other is pretty darn horrible, that life itself is sometimes not all that great, like in Europe in 1914, right? Mustard gas, right? Airplanes, you can finally conquer gravity. And what are they doing with them? They're dropping bombs. They're shooting at people on the ground. Technology, machinery, great, right? New world. You saw the machine shot. What do? You make a tank. It just becomes really depressing after a while. And so this idea of escape is so strong and so poignant with so many artists all through Europe in the second decade, right, in the teens, and especially during the war. Well, Delaunay can be one of many artists who can claim to sort of really get out there and drop representation altogether. Even though the title suggests that this is almost like a telescope, right? Looking at the sun and the moon. Not that you should ever look at the sun through a telescope, but looking at the sun and the moon through a telescope, right? I guess this is what would happen to you if you did. That's what you would see for the rest of your life. Would be nothing but burn marks. Having looked at the sun and the moon through. But the round canvas, right, gives us that sense of having sort of looked through something. And then we get this idea of almost like an eclipse, right, the sun and the moon. These simultaneous contrasts. And when he got to this point where he stops representing per se, right, he calls these things pure painting. Right? This is not, and there's something about painting that doesn't have to be about representation. This is up at MoMA, by the way, in New York, right? It's huge, too. It's about 3.5 feet across. It's really large, right? Quite a terrific piece. Still, the thing about Delaunay and his colors, it goes back to this idea of transportation that I was talking about before, transporting, right? Supernatural, metaphysical ideas. Because even if the title suggests the observed world, nothing in the painting really does. That's not what you see, right? But over and above that, the things that he's looking at, the sun and the moon, are celestial bodies, right? They're also things that suggest transportation outside of our normal experience, getting away from the mundane elements of this particular world. So simultaneous became a theme for him. In fact, he coined a term called simultaneity, right? I should have a little blue box up there, but I don't. But from simultaneous, right? Simultaneous, and get rid of the us, O-U-S, and put I-T-Y instead, right? Simultaneity, right? Is what he called this. And it's sort of a sub-movement, simultaneity. It's sort of a sub-movement of the Orphists, where again they're using color to move us away from this world to the other, right? That's Orpheus, right? Painting ideas of sound, that's Orpheus as well, right? Color and harmony to tame nature, that's Orpheus as well. But a subset of that is this idea of simultaneity, that he has these ideas about color existing in simultaneous contrast, where it's the contrast of the colors that bring the harmony. His first forays into this idea were inspired by looking through a window. He had an apartment in Paris. He looks out the window and he sees nothing but a series of reflections and refractions through glass. Because, glass offers us this wonderful ability to look through it and then look back at ourselves at the same time, right? Because it's reflective on a certain level in addition to being transparent, right? So it's this material, and it's a material that became more widespread in the modern world. So a lot of artists look at glass as a sort of metaphor for the modern world, because we're using it now this machine-made plate glass rather than hand-blown glass from earlier centuries, right? It's being able to be put in entire walls of buildings made out of glass because of the use of iron for construction and steel that allows us not to worry about a wall having to bear the load of the ceiling anymore because it's borne on 2 or 3 pillars of steel, right? And that means the area between can be filled with anything you want, like glass. And you can get a building that is totally see-through, right? It's nothing but a cage covered in glass. You don't need the stone anymore, right? And that became this great metaphor for the modern world with glass and steel. That's our new world, right? They love things like train sheds, where, this big empty space that's covered in glass and steel and is continuous with the outside world, right? And bigger than anything that anybody's ever seen. And simple, quick to throw up. Right? These were modern buildings. It's not account for going back to Manet, why he's so enthralled with the railway, first class we saw. That's so modern, right? Well, here's Delaunay looking now through his window, and we get this idea of all these refractions and transparencies coexisting, right? Reflecting and being transparent at the same time. And communicating that idea with color, right? And to the point where you can't tell if maybe part of the window is even open or not, because that whole experience continues around. And I think he's also picking up the idea of how, when the window catches the light that's partly open, it will reflect on the walls as well, so that the windows themselves become part of the solid environment too, right? All of that is interwoven, and he's looking out now across the Champ de Mars in Paris, and what does he see? The Eiffel Tower, right? See it there in the middle, the green, right? You might have missed it at first because of everything else being so abstract, but, there it is right there, right? That's after my drawing skills in my finger, right? And the Eiffel Tower becomes also for him. It's not a metaphor of a building that isn't. Buildings have always been solid exteriors enclosing space, right? And when you get buildings that are made of steel and glass, then that starts to break down. And the Eiffel Tower breaks down as well. Because the Eiffel Tower is simply the cage without the glass. It's just metal. And there's more void, there's more nothing than there is something in the space taken up by the Eiffel Tower, right? The solids are secondary to the void. And the whole thing was simply come up in the first place, in 1889, as a demonstration of what you could do with steel. That's it. That was all that Eiffel meant with that. Like, look, there's some new potential. We can make the tightest building in the world, We can leave the steel exposed, and it kind of looks okay, And it obviously does because they left it up. It was not meant to be a permanent construction. And now it's a symbol of Paris, right? What else says Paris as much as the Eiffel Tower, right? You buy baubles in the airport for your desktop, right? And so he's looking out at this very, very modern building, still modern, 30 years later, 25 years later, as a metaphor for things that are tangible but aren't, things that are solid but aren't, right? Equal parts. He had a wife who was also a painter, Sonia Delaunay-Turc. Also, like Robert Delaunay, worked in collages, also with the idea of trying to use elements of the visible world that were metaphors for the spiritual, solar, right, the sun. Every culture looks at the sun and thinks of God, And so calling this solar prism suggests sunlight refracted into color, right? That's what prisms do. And achieving that through this sort of simple torn up, cut up collage, right? Follows some of the sense of our interest in the golden section that we saw, the way things spool out from a complicated core to a sort of more open area on the outside, right? For Hunter and the other people in the fashion here, there's a Robert Delaunay behind her, and there's a Sonia Delaunay in the foreground. She got into dress fabric design, right? Applying these principles of simultaneity into clothing. And the idea, of course, is remember what Robert said, was that light obliterates everything, right? Light permeates everything. It's everywhere, and it has the ability to take over other parts of the physical world. So Sonia is applying that idea. It's letting it take over the clothing. And she remains in the history of modern art an incredibly important figure because she's one of the first to do something that we're going to see a lot of modern artists do, and that's to think about their art as something more than a framed picture on the wall. The history of painting is often it's a framed picture on the wall. So sometimes it's the entire wall, but the idea is it's a picture on the wall. And for modern art, with these bigger ideas, these huge ideas about the relationship or the ability of art to affect your being, right? To change your life. It's a big idea, right? As you get to that point, art has to break free of the frame. It's got to get off the wall. It's got to do something else to have and realize that impact, right? And Sonia applies it to clothes, and we're going to see that 10 years later, a lot of the people pick up this idea and say, let's apply modern art principles to design, a coffee cup. Let's apply modern art principles to the way in which we construct houses, right? Because if it really is, if modern art is supposed to change our lives, reflect what we're doing in the modern world, but also make the modern world a better place, then it's got to do more than hang on the wall, right? And Sonia Delaunay is such an important figure for beginning to apply those ideas. She's one of the earliest, right, at this time. Another artist from this group looks very much like Robert Delaunay in this particular picture, but also part of this Orphist group working in Puteaux in the suburbs. Again, part of the Golden Section group as well, where you can still see those Fibonacci spirals kind of working through his different works, is this wonderful Czech artist who I never had heard of until I taught modern art for the first time. I never sort of paid any attention to František Kupka, which is just kind of fun to say. František Kupka, right? Part of the Orphist group working in Puteaux, from Czechoslovakia. Like Delaunay, he's trying to paint pure light. He's really trying to get to a kind of painting that is pure, but he's also interested, I think you can see this, in machinery as well. There's this idea of something threading through gears. As we looked at that orange bit that comes down and around the two wheels, suggests almost like, maybe, I never thought of this before, right? But doesn't this kind of, this bit here, right, that does that. I know that my red on red is not the best color choice for that, right? But it almost looks like film threading through an old projector. You know, if you ever looked at an old 35 millimeter film projector, it's got to thread through the gears as it works its way in front of the light, and the gears make it go and stop, you know, at 24 beats per second. And that's how we see movies move, is from that strobing effect, right, of it coming and stopping and then moving on, right? And that idea that it's where light makes everything else, right? Everything else is a product of light. Sorry? It's totally part of this as well. Yeah, he's part of the Golden Section group, and you can totally see it, can't you? The way that Fibonacci thing works. But I think that there might be something quasi-representational here as well, but totally removed, right? I just have the sense that there's something going on with gears meshing down below, those three circles that fit together at the bottom, and the strand that moves its way through them. These bolts mesh together, difference in size. The one on the right is about like yay, you know, roughly under 2 feet tall, right? The one on the left is about 6 feet tall, right? It's monster. 79 inches, so what is that? 6.5 feet tall, right? And even though he gives it a very abstract title, and both of these works really do look primarily abstract, not representational at all, he claims again that he's painting sound. And I think just like the Delaunay piece we saw, Jamie had mentioned I could see sound in that Delaunay right away. I think you can here as well. I can see the sound of cymbals crashing, right, in an orchestra. It's a brass sound. You know, that sort of eruption of a sharp, quick, reverberating sound. And as it moves out, you can see it as if it were sound waves. And I don't know when we, as humans, got the technology to visualize sound waves, right? Because we can now, you know, ultrasound and whatnot. We can visualize sound waves. But I don't know when that technology came about. I don't know. I'd like to think it is. Yeah. But if I were researching Kupka, or any of these guys that are interested in sort of finding an abstract way to depict sound, that's something I probably want to look into a bit further, right? When did we mechanically get the capacity to illustrate sound? Well, Kupka is definitely working on that very same idea of trying to illustrate sound. And so we have a source in the middle, and again, Elaine, yes, definitely the golden section playing a huge part in how the compositions lay out. Are you guys in the studio art classes going to go try this next time? You put a composition down and figure out how to make it work? I better overlay a golden section. Yeah, it can do more than cross your mind. That's why we make you take this class. You see, those of you in studio art have no choice. You've got to be here, right? But I find this picture not only is it fascinating for that idea of how effective it is at catching that sense of sound moving, right? Waves and whatnot. And you know, when I was in high school a long time ago, but when I was in college too, I was really interested in physics. Like I just got into it for a while because I had a really good physics teacher, so I got into it, right? And one of the things I really liked about physics were all the toys you got to play with in a physics class, right? And one of them was the wave table, right? So you had a table filled with a thin sheet of water, and you have this little thing that would go like that, and it would make the waves, and you would watch how the waves came together and came apart, and that's the analogy for sound. Isn't that like what he's picking up here, how those different waves, when they hit each other, like this area down here, that affect each other as well? I think it's utterly successful in what it's trying to do. This is a picture about sound, right? The experience of noise, and in this case, a particular sound. And as we dive in, just like how, you know, how the golden section, it just keeps going and going. It's kind of infinite, you know. As we trace the snail to the middle, we could just keep going, really, if we could draw that fine, right? Because it's that ratio of the golden rectangle, right? And as we dive into the picture and get further and further down, it's almost like each part of it could be a smaller golden section. And this is what puts him in this Orpheus camp, right? Because the golden section is, again, that key that links nature to the infinite, nature to something bigger. Also, I think Kupka is actually a really good painter. I mean, when you look at this and you see how he's working with the paint in the different areas and the color choices he makes, they're just fantastic. Right? It's a really beautiful picture. And again, it's the sort of thing where when you think about modern art, who's ever heard of František Kupka before, right? And it's one of those things where he gets a footnote, but I think he deserves a bigger place at the table than people often give him. And again, it's one of these artists right around the same time frame that are ditching representation in the classical sense and making paintings that aren't about things you see in nature anymore, right? And that's many artists at this time have that sort of claim to fame. There's a couple of Americans that came to Paris right around the same time as the Puteaux group and became very much influenced by the Orphists. And one of them that we have in our local collection is Stanton McDonald Wright. The other one was Morgan Russell. We don't have any good examples of his pictures here. But McDonald Wright, again, you'd probably be forgiven for thinking that this was a Delaunay. It has certain similarities to Delaunay, and that is certainly here. He, on arriving in Paris and then looking at Orphism and reading some of the things that Delaunay was writing about simultaneity, came up with his own concept of color and sound in art. And he called his synchromism. And again, these are all under the broader umbrella of Orphism, synchromism. And what the term refers to is sort of simultaneous effects of color. So sync, right, simultaneous, you sync your watches, they make them the same. And chrome, right, chromatic is the color scale, right? So color is looked at simultaneously. And as he developed this idea, he picked up a musical analogy. And he said that there was a direct analogy between the 12 colors on a basic color wheel. Right? The primaries, secondaries, tertiaries. Right? So you guys know the basic color wheel? Anybody not know the basic color wheel? Don't be afraid. Right? Primaries are what? Red, yellow, blue, tertiaries between those, right? So red, yellow is orange, blue, yellow is green, red, blue is purple, or violet, right? Tertiaries are between those. So you get red, orange, and yellow, orange, right? So those 12 colors, the 12 basics of the color wheel, Stanton McDonald Wright said had a direct analogy to the 12-tone musical scale. And that he was very precise and very specific about this. That each color had a direct musical analogy. That we could take that 12, even though we tend to think of colors on a wheel and notes on a scale, which are different visualizations of the two. He said you could take each color and it's a flag, right? It's a sharp, right? And work them through that way. And that in the same way that a musician, composer, tries to put together musical notes based on the harmonious juxtaposition of these different notes to make up chords, right? So to an artist can put colors together to become chords, right? And can compose works of art as little symphonies based on the sounds, those tones. And it wasn't sort of willy-nilly. It wasn't haphazard. He's not just pulling your leg. He was very, very serious about this and very, very precise about how these connections work. And these are some really fascinating ideas about these connections between colors. And remember, going back to what we talked about before, and I'll give you a second here, how much artists were respectful of musicians because music was seen as being purer, right? Was seen as being more purely aesthetic as a product, whereas art has this representational function, right? That kept it from being purely aesthetic. Okay? So music becomes for them a very, very strong way in which they can break through the barrier to a new kind of art that no one had really ever thought of before. Yeah, today.
It's also really interesting that when you did that, because the chromatic scale is when you hit every single note in order.
Really?
Yeah. So if you go like A, band. So when you have to hit every single note, like all the class, all the shirts, and everything like in order.
Mm-hmm.
I was really interested in just comparing it to
Yeah.
every single color.
And that's
you can see all the gradients there. I'm
curious to when the chromatic scale started becoming called the chromatic scale as well, right? If that was a new thing. Imagine if in 1913 they first started calling the tonal scale the chromatic scale. And then Stanford McDonald Wright goes, chrome, color, of course, right? Polychrome, right? Multiple colors. Yeah. You'll also notice with him, goes back to something else we've been talking about that we haven't seen much in the last few works we looked at. And that is there's a sort of machine look to this, isn't there? Right? The forms that he gets start to look like little, polished cones, right? Or cylinders, machine parts. And almost as if those machine parts are actively moving as we're looking at them too, right? Which is, I think, really kind of fascinating because it leads us to the last of these groups that sort of function as an offshoot of Cubism and come out of these same ideas. So here's Fernand Léger, and we don't have it. This is really early Léger. Long career. We'll look at some of the later stuff. This one's up in Philadelphia, but also has these sort of machine-like forms, right? And again, by the way, primary colors. Right? Seth and I were talking about that when we were looking at this picture in my office, but we just talked about it a second ago. Nothing but yellows, reds, and blues on a white ground. And the way he applies them in these cylinders that look as if they're shiny, look as if they're spinning in space, right? They look like a series of snare drums or something, with polished exteriors, the blue bits in the middle. No representation, even though they do seem to be a series of solids, right? So he, too, is part of this group. He's a member of the Puto group. He was a member of the Golden Section. And branches out for that into a sort of a different direction. So again, art that's moving beyond representation, entirely ditching it. Some connections to Cubism, obviously, from looking at it, but with some changes as well. This one's up in the Baltimore Museum of Art. It's much smaller, as you can tell from the grain on the work. And again, these sort of machine-like forms of synthetic cubist collage look to the entire thing, but with the colors applied in a sort of machine-like way, especially those blues. The ways in which they move from dark to light suggest a rounded metallic form that you see the highlights on. But again, totally abstract. He calls this style, Léger does, purism. And this is, again, another of these offshoots that develop out of the Puto group, purism. And the term refers to the idea that, and this is antithetical in a way, it's a variation from, we were just looking at works of art that where the solid object's gone, right? Whether we're talking about Kupka or Delaunay. We're talking about works of art where the solid object is replaced by pure color and light, or the evocation of sound, right? Nothing solid. Well, with Léger and purism, we're going to get solid. And the idea of purism, the idea that lies behind it, is that one could reduce the world to pure forms, pure, simplified forms. This may derive from Cézanne's famous comment that all of nature is a cube, a cylinder, or a cone. Right? That's it. And everything can be reduced to that. And the logic of optimism, well, why don't you then? Right? Purism says that the world is pure, can be purified. The artist can purify the world by making it into these increasingly simplified forms. And the other thing that the purists championed was the fact that this was already happening around us. This was actually happening in the observed world. And it was happening because of industry and because of the machine, because of mass production. That once things are made by machine versus by hand, where everything that comes out of the machine is stamped exactly the same, then the form has been purified by the machine. Right? It's been reduced to its essentials, which we might see as kind of boring, but was seen as really a really fascinating new thing, a symbol for the modern world. And they have to be, right? If they don't fit. Right? You buy your furniture from IKEA, and if it's not done on the machine and those little pegs that you use in your bookshelf aren't the same size exactly, they're not going to fit in the hole. Or, you pound them in, they're not going to work, or they're going to fall out. Right? You're going to put together an automobile, and you've got the different parts of the car coming out of these factories, and they've got to fit, or else it doesn't work. They've been purified. And Léger and others in the team were looking looking around them at the world now filled with automobiles and airplanes and ocean liners and modern architecture, and they're saying the world is being purified into simplified, perfected forms. And using painting now to try to evoke those simplified forms. Well, we're running a bit behind, right? I haven't hit futurism yet, which runs the machine as well. So I had mentioned before that the next essay would be due on Friday. Let's hold it off, because we're not going to get there yet, okay? Yes. You're still going to have to do it, Dina. Just don't have to do it on Friday. You get the weekend to work on it, exactly. The other thing I did when I put that up, just quickly before you put your stuff away, the other thing I'll update the website, right? I'll take care of it like we did. But I want to only focus on the two early expressionist groups, the bridge and the blue rider. Okay? Expressions in this life or business. Right? There's lots of expressions out there. But just for 1.5 inch paper, each two will be different. Right? So die Brücke, the bridge, and their blaue Reiter, the blue rider, are the only two we focus on, and only our OER groups. So like you have sources for each of those only. Okay? So that's all you need to work on for this, and not everything else, because otherwise it's going to be like this. Okay? Okay, I'll see you guys on Friday then.